evening. First things first, could everybody switch their mobile phone off or to silent? I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Indigenous custodians of the land that we're gathered on tonight, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the first storytellers of this land. I'd also like to welcome Peter Greste, head members, writers and all others who have joined us here today for the PEN Sydney Three Voices lecture. I'm Zoe Rodriguez, President of PEN Sydney and Chair of PEN International Search Committee. I'd like to acknowledge the significant support we received from the Copyright Agency's Cultural Fund. It lets us run these free Voices lectures and also commission a series of articles relevant to freedom of expression for publication in the PEN Sydney magazine that you will get at or there are a number of copies at the end of the session that will be handed out by volunteers. And Cal has been a very long-term supporter of PEN Sydney and PEN Melbourne. I also want to acknowledge the Sydney Writers' Festival. It's been a long-term host of PEN's Free Voices lectures, and this year marks a deepening in our relationship with the Sydney Writers' Festival, who were willing to make this a ticketed event and to share the proceeds of the ticket price with PEN for everybody. So thank you all very much, and thank you, PEN Sydney. This is a very welcome source of support for us as we go about promoting freedom of expression in Australia and in the Asia Pacific, and enabling us to support the PEN International office in London, where immense research and advocacy work is taken up all around the world. The order for today: Peter will deliver the lecture. There will be 20 minutes for questions and answers, and then we'll have book signing for Peter in the foyer for his books. And for anybody who doesn't know about PEN, we're an NGO. We were the first NGO in the world, founded in 1921 in London. The Sydney office opened in 1931, and we are dedicated to fighting for freedom of expression and to fight to get imprisoned writers out of prison. So our goals are to emphasise the role of literature in the development of mutual understanding and world culture, to fight for freedom of expression and to act as a powerful voice on behalf of writers harassed, imprisoned and sometimes killed for their views. The empty chair that you will see on the stage symbolises the writer who cannot be with us today due to imprisonment. There are very many authors who could have that honour tonight, sadly, but tonight this chair is dedicated to Behrouz Booshani, the Kurdish Iranian journalist and poet who remains marooned on Manus Island, even if not formally imprisoned there now. I want to read from an article we commissioned from him from PEN Sydney, and he says, "I'm an imprisoned writer from a country controlled by religious dictatorship, and I have experienced 5 years of living and writing unrelentingly in Manus prison. I have arrived at a unique understanding of concepts such as politics, liberty and freedom of speech. In a country like Iran, you do not have the freedom to write what you wish, but in a liberal democracy, you are relatively free to write as you like. However, the system can censor you with ease, censor you in a systematic way, silence you in ways that even if you were to shout, no one would hear. And even if they hear you, they do not have the capacity to understand. This has been my experience in Manus." And he then reflects, "I am like this little schoolboy left to fight against a giant bully. What I am saying is that like many people in the world, PEN was not able to understand or believe what Australia, a so-called democracy, was doing to us in the Manus prison, and so was slow in supporting our cases and promoting our voices." You'll find a response from Australia's and the Asia Pacific's Vice President of PEN International on the following page, and that is why we exist, it explains. So, the other thing we have to note today is that tomorrow, of course, is World Press Freedom Day, and PEN International is focusing its campaigning on the case of Daphne Caruana Galizia, a renowned journalist who was killed in Malta on the 16th of October last year in a targeted car bomb attack. The 6-month anniversary was 16 April, and Penn followed up with an open letter signed by hundreds of writers from around the world, and we continue to press about that. But now on to tonight's lecture. I think all of you have heard the name Peter Greste, and you probably saw him on the ABC last night. He is an Australian journalist who's worked as a correspondent for Reuters, CNN and the BBC, predominantly in the Middle East, Latin America and Africa. A former Al Jazeera correspondent who spent 400 days in an Egyptian prison after being arrested in Cairo along with his two Al Jazeera colleagues for news that was damaging to national security. And he was sentenced to 7 years prison and then released without explanation. He's received a Peabody Award in 2011 for his BBC documentary on Somalia, and the Australian Human Rights Medal in 2015 for his advocacy for a free press. In 2016, with his family, he published Freedom Peter, about the international media campaign they waged to champion his release, and last year he published The First Casualty, from the front lines of the global war on journalism. In February this year, he joined the University of Queensland as its UNESCO Chair in Journalism and Communications, and as we know, he's recently made the Monash and Me documentary, the second episode screened last night. Peter, can I invite you to deliver this year's Sydney Writers' Festival Free Voices Lecture?
Thank you very much, Lauren. And it's a fantastic honour to be here this evening, and always humbling to be speaking at a Penn lecture with an empty chair. I'd note that if we were to have chairs up here for every journalist in prison alone, remember this is not every writer but every journalist, there'd probably be no room on stage for me because we'd have 262 chairs up on stage as of December 1st last year, which is, as you'll see in a few minutes, a record since the numbers were, since the Committee for the Protection of Journalists started counting the numbers. Ladies and gentlemen, a few years ago, President Obama came to Australia, and he stood before a special joint session of Parliament in Australia, and he declared that the currents of history may ebb and flow, but over time they move decisively in a single direction. History, he said, is on the side of the free. Free societies, free governments, free economies, free people. Well, Democracy 101 tells us that you can't have a functioning democracy without a free press. We know that. So, what do the numbers tell us about the direction that we're moving in? Well, this is a lecture, of course. You guys did sign up for it, and as you know, and particularly as I've come to learn as a professor, you can't have a lecture without a PowerPoint presentation. Don't worry, it's not going to be too tedious. There are just a few numbers here that I think really help to illustrate the point that I'm trying to make this evening. Freedom House has been an organisation that's been tracking press freedom for quite some years, since the early 1990s in fact. And what it's done is that over time it's created a map which tells us roughly what's been happening. This is from 1995. Now these are in a 5-year chunks, and you'll see the green areas are the areas that Freedom House regards as countries or regions that have what they would call a free press. Across North America, large chunks of Latin America, parts of Southern Africa, Australia, and of course Europe. If we go fast forward to 5 years, to 2000, you'll see the green areas have disappeared, the yellow areas have extended, the yellow areas are the problem zones, and then the purple areas, which are the real trouble zones, have extended into Central Asia and North Asia. Let's go forward again to 2005. Slight fight back. You'll notice those areas in Africa, there's a bit of a fight back in the green areas in Africa. But the rest of the world remained pretty bleak. 2010 started to turn yellow. 2015, which is when we had the latest chunk, the purple areas have gotten even worse. Now, according to Freedom House, in the last report, it declared the press freedom around the world is the worst that it's been in 13 years. It kind of challenges President Obama's fundamental contention that things keep moving in direction of freedom. I want to read you a line also from another report very recently, from the Reporters Sans Frontières, Reporters Without Borders, in which they said that global press freedom declined. The 2018 World Press Freedom Index reflects growing animosity towards journalists. Hostility towards the media, openly encouraged by political leaders, and the efforts of authoritarian regimes to exploit their vision of journalism pose a threat to democracies. So things aren't really going so well at the moment. So what's going on here? A few more sets of statistics that I think are going to help us. This is a map that the Committee for the Protection of Journalists has produced, and it covers the attacks on the press. The grey blobs represent those areas where journalists have been imprisoned, and the red spots are areas where journalists have been killed. And again, you'll see that it broadly reflects the regions that Freedom House was concerned about. This graph here, this set of figures, shows the number of journalists who've been killed since the CPJ started collecting the numbers in 1991. And what I want to draw your attention to, a couple of things. First of all, there's the overall shape of the graph. You'll see that we had in the early 90s that fairly substantial hump. And that's from those rather terrible civil wars in Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, in Somalia. And those conflicts saw a lot of local journalists being killed because they were caught up on either side of the ethnic divide and therefore drawn into the slaughter. And we saw a dip through the 90s, the late 90s, and then in the 2000s the numbers started to climb again. We hit a peak in 2008 when 75 journalists were killed on the job. The numbers have stayed more or less consistent. This is a little bit, it isn't quite as accurate, but what it shows is are those journalists who have been confirmed as murdered for their work. If you include the numbers of journalists and other media workers who've been killed, and those in the cases where we're not entirely sure of the motives, the numbers are consistently up around 100. But they have tailed off a little bit in the last few years, and I suppose you could take some comfort from that. But a colleague in Somalia made the point that in Somalia too, they've seen the numbers of journalists being murdered drop off. But my Somali colleague believes that's not because the killers of journalists have seen the error of their ways. It's because journalists have learned not to cover stories that are going to put them at risk. Let's have a look at another set of figures. This is the number of journalists imprisoned. And what we see is something quite similar. The hump through the 90s, a dip through the late 1990s, and then we end up with a peak from the early 2000s all the way up to the present, where the last 2 years were records for the numbers of journalists imprisoned. So what's going on here? Well, let me bring up one last graph before we start talking about some of the reasons. This is a graphic that shows something I'm sure you'll appreciate, interests me in particular, and that's the reasons that journalists have been imprisoned, the charges that they're facing. This is a graph that shows those charges. Now you'll see the yellow quadrant up in the far left-hand corner. Those charges related to journalists' work. Things like defamation, false news, other charges which may or may not be directly related to their writing. There's a section where we've got two types of charges, a mix of charges that journalists are facing, but what we can comfortably say is that at least 3/4 of the journalists who've been imprisoned are there on anti-state charges. The CPJ defines anti-state charges as things like treason, sedition, charges just as we were facing in Egypt, terrorism charges. Now, Zoe mentioned that we were charged with broadcasting false news to undermine national security. In a way, that's a little bit of an understatement. We were charged with, in Egypt, with being members of a terrorist organisation, aiding and abetting a terrorist organisation, financing a terrorist organisation, and yes, broadcasting false news. The Egyptian government insisted that we weren't there for our journalism, just as so many of the others that are in prison. It says that it has, in its constitution, protections for the press, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. We weren't there because of our journalism, we were there because we were terrorists, according to the Egyptian government. Now, I'll come to this a little bit later, but let's go back to that dip in the 2000s. What was it that changed then? You don't need to be a historian to remember that we had 9/11. And shortly after the 9/11 attacks, George W. Bush stood up and delivered a speech to a joint session of the House of Congress and the Senate. And in that speech, Bush said, "In this war on terror, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists." What he did in that in that speech, effectively make things a binary conflict. Let's go back to pre-9/11. I was a correspondent in Afghanistan in 1995-96. And back then, what we had was a war that was fairly typical of a lot of the conflicts over that period. Wars over tangible things, over stuff, like land, ethnicity, water, sectarianism, religious belief, and so on. And in those kinds of conflicts, the kind of conflicts you can put your hands on, things that you can point to, journalists have been observers, often inconvenient observers, yes, often targeted because of reporting that they were doing that may have exposed the kinds of things that belligerents in those conflicts wanted to keep covered up. But we weren't targeted for who we were as journalists. I remember in Afghanistan, we would often go across the front lines to speak to the opposition because I felt that we had a professional obligation to fulfill our duties, to speak to all of the parties to a conflict. And in fact, I felt that it was a question of our own security, where if we had spent enough time on the front lines, sooner or later, someone on the other side was going to see me, a white guy, clean-shaven, in his rifle sights. And I didn't want that guy to see me as the enemy. I wanted him to understand that I was there as an observer and that he also had that sort of value in me being there. I didn't want him to pull the trigger. And that's how it was for us in Afghanistan. We crossed the front lines routinely. Guess who it was that was laying siege to Kabul in those days? It was the Taliban. We were encouraged by both belligerents to speak to them, to find out what was going on in the war, but also by governments who wanted us to interrogate all sides in the conflict to make sense of what was taking place in Afghanistan. Let's fast forward to 2001, when I went back to Afghanistan again with the BBC team. When things had changed, because what happened was when George W. Bush made his statement, he effectively turned the conflict into a binary one. You are either with us or you're with the terrorists. And in the process, it meant that if you as a journalist crossed that front line to speak to the other side in pursuit of the most fundamental elements of our profession, you were accused of broadcasting terrorist ideology. Now, at the time, we didn't quite see it. At the time, we didn't really understand what was going on. But there are a few things that perhaps we should have seen. One of the first groups of journalists to be killed after the collapse of the Taliban was a group of journalists, including a very close friend of mine, Maria Grazzi-Catulli, a wonderful Italian reporter, and an Australian cameraman, Harry Burton, along with a number of other journalists. They were travelling from a town called Jalalabad in east Afghanistan up to Kabul. Their vehicle was intercepted by a group of Taliban. They were dragged out of their vehicles Everyone else in the convoy was allowed to go free, but the journalists were pulled into the hills around a town called Eroded, and the Taliban emptied the magazines of their Kalashnikovs into them. At the trial, they report, in the trial afterwards, they said that they were operating under orders from their Taliban commanders specifically to kill journalists. The Americans dropped a bomb squarely on the Al Jazeera bureau, which at the time also managed to get one of the first interviews, in fact the first interview, with the one person who I wager every journalist in the world would have wanted to speak to at that point, and that was Osama bin Laden. But Al Jazeera was accused of broadcasting terrorist ideology. All of a sudden, as I said earlier, if you do what you were supposed to do as a journalist, if you crossed the line, if you spoke to the other side, you became a target. In a way, what happened at 9/11 was we saw a shift from a war over tangible things to a war over ideas. And in that conflict of ideas, the place where ideas are transmitted becomes by definition a part of the battlefield. That's the media. And so journalists have become targets in ways that we were never in the decades leading up to 9/11. Now, in this conflict, journalists, as I said, are not just being targeted by governments, but we are being targeted by the extremists as well. Not just the Taliban. Think of Daniel Pearl, who was murdered by Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, but also early in 2002. Think of James Foley, Stephen Sokoloff, the two freelance American journalists who were murdered by Islamic State in Syria in 2014 while I was in prison in Egypt. Think of Charlie Hebdo, a magazine that was shot up by a group of extremists. And just recently, a couple of days ago, we saw 10 journalists murdered in Afghanistan. One of them, a BBC reporter, was assassinated in a shooting. 9 other journalists who were covering the aftermath of a suicide bomb attack were killed when a bomber disguised himself as a cameraman, stood amongst the journalists, and then blew himself up. 10 journalists in one day, the bloodiest single day for journalists in Afghanistan since the war on terror began. So this is not a hypothetical problem. This attack on journalism that pivoted around 9/11 is something that all of us feel. Take us in Afghanistan, me and my two colleagues. We were working in Egypt. In Egypt we were working, covering really what was an unfolding political crisis. And I've got to be honest, I wasn't doing anything particularly brilliant in Egypt. The journalism wasn't challenging. I was only there for 2 weeks. I was based in Nairobi, and I went up to Cairo to cover the Christmas New Year period. So I didn't know the story very well. Now, as a journalist, what happens is that the more time you spend in a particular story, the more you understand it, the more you get a feel for the edges of the story. You start to understand how far you can push things before you're going to upset people on either side of the story. And because in Egypt I didn't know where those limits were, I was playing with a very straight bat. I was treading water. As I said, it was nothing particularly challenging. And so, on the night of December 28th, when the authorities came after us, and I got that knock on the door of my hotel room, I had absolutely no idea what was coming. The charges that we were facing were absolutely staggering to me. I thought this would be over in a night or two until the interrogator told me what the charges were. The charges were about as serious as you could possibly get without actually pulling the trigger on a Kalashnikov. And I struggled enormously to try and reconcile the gap between what we were doing, relatively mundane journalism, and what we were accused of doing, which was acts of terrorism. And the more I thought about it, because a lot of people have said, look, you're being naive about this. This was about a dispute between Egypt and Qatar. This was about an internecine Middle Eastern conflict. And that you were a pawn in that larger game. And that might well be true. And to a certain extent, I think that probably was true. But the problem was that if you wanted to make a point, the Egyptians wanted to make a point about Qatar and malfeasance in Egypt, why arrest an Australian and 2 Egyptians? My 2 colleagues, Mohammed Thani and Bahar Mohammed, were both Egyptians. If you wanted to make a point about Al Jazeera in particular messing around in Egypt, supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, why arrest an Australian who'd only been in the country for 2 weeks and had no deep connection? Because if you wanted to make that point, there were plenty of other journalists who could have manufactured a case. Not me. The more I thought about it, the more I realised that the only reason I was in prison was because the authorities wanted to make a point. Yes, they came after us because we were politically convenient, because they thought that Egyptians in the outside world would buy into that broader narrative about Qatari interference in Egypt and Al Jazeera's supposed messing with the Muslim Brotherhood. But fundamentally, this was about intimidating journalists across the board in Egypt. It was about scaring the living daylights out of them. It didn't matter who I was. In fact, it was probably better as far as the Egyptian authorities were concerned that I was an outsider, because it made it abundantly clear to every other journalist working there, whether local or foreign, that if you did your professional duty and spoke to everyone involved in the conflict, including the Muslim Brotherhood, who, by the way, remember, only 6 months earlier had been ousted from government in a coup as the first democratically elected government that Egypt had ever had. Egypt was using the war on terror as an excuse, was using national security as an excuse. Egypt, of course, isn't the only country. Turkey is the world's greatest jail of journalists at the moment. Same thing. If you challenge the government, if you try and interrogate all sides of the conflict, if you go and interview someone from the opposition, the Gulenist movement, you're branded a terrorist. If you go and speak to the Kurds, you're branded a terrorist. If you dissent from the government, you're branded a terrorist. It's not just Egypt and Turkey. Malaysia, a few weeks ago, passed a law criminalising false news. Nothing wrong with that, of course, on principle. We all want to make sure that the public discourse has accurate information and good reporting. But who gets to decide what news is true and what news is false? It's the government. What of that great champion of democracy, of liberal democracy, of liberalism, of freedom of speech, the United States? Well, I have a great deal of respect for Barack Obama. He spoke very forcefully in our case. He spoke personally to President Sisi on several occasions, urging him to release us. But guess what? In 1917, towards the end of the First World War, the United States passed the Espionage Bill. And it was designed to do what it said on the tin. It's designed to go after foreign spies, from anybody that would try to undermine the United States government, to compromise national security in the service of a foreign government. Well, from 1917 until 2008, the Espionage Bill had been used a total of 5 times. From 2008 until 2016, while Barack Obama was in power, the bill was used more than twice as often as all of the predecessors combined. Depending on how you do the sums, it may not be quite twice as often, but there's a few cases that are a little bit grey, but the numbers still stand up to scrutiny. Now that would be understandable perhaps if those people who'd been prosecuted were people that were giving CIA tactics away to Islamic State perhaps, or giving Pentagon secrets to the Russians. But that wasn't the case. In almost every case, the Obama administration chose to prosecute either journalists or their sources because of stories that turned out to be politically embarrassing. Now, lest we get too smug about this in Australia, what have we got here? Well, Section 35P of the ASIO Act makes it a criminal offence for anybody to disclose any information at all around what's called a special intelligence operation, an SIO. The minister gets to decide what is an SIO and what is not, and that designation exists in perpetuity. Now again, this is designed, as far as the government is concerned, to try and protect national security secrets, to try and stop people from compromising the security agencies in their operations. And I get that. But I'd argue that up until now we've had pretty good legal systems, pretty good protections in place that have served us pretty well. There aren't too many times you see a piece in the paper about an intelligence operation that hasn't yet happened, or a piece in the paper that exposes the identity of an ASIO officer. But I would also argue that journalists have a responsibility, a fundamental responsibility, to interrogate all aspects of the government's work, including the operations of the security services. Now again, let me make it abundantly clear that I'm not arguing that we need to throw open the books entirely. I recognise the need for secrecy and security in the current environment. But what we've learned to our cost in so many places around the world, whether it's in liberal democracies or in authoritarian regimes, is that the more dark spaces you create, the more areas you shut off from public scrutiny, the more opportunities you create for bad things to happen. The foreign fighters legislation stops us from speaking, from publishing, from broadcasting anything that might be seen as promoting terrorist ideology. Fair enough, perhaps. A few weeks ago, we saw a control order slapped on a story that news.com.au was about to publish. That story covered a strategy that was being used by Islamic State to try and gather recruits through the online sales websites like Gumtree. Now, that story was banned, it was censored because the government said that it was broadcasting, publishing terrorist ideology. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd rather know about that kind of strategy. That to me seems a really important part of public debate, and it's hard to see how that information is going to encourage someone who isn't already inclined to terrorism from taking a look. What about the data retention legislation? Data retention legislation, the government says, was to give the authorities the power to investigate the metadata of any Australian without a warrant, so that they could disrupt terrorist activities. Again, understandable perhaps in the environment where we're trying to protect ourselves from terrorism and extremism. But think about what that does. It usurps one of the most deeply embedded systems of accountability, of checks that we have, and that's the warrant system, where you have to go to a magistrate to justify why it is that you want to look into a person's metadata, why you want to search a particular individual, to a magistrate. The magistrate agrees that there is due course, that there is evidence. Well, there was a bit of a hue and cry, and the journalist said you can't do that to our sources because we have a principle for protecting our sources. And so the authorities said, okay, we will create a special magistrate, a secret magistrate, which compels anyone who wants to investigate a journalist's metadata to seek a warrant first. That's great, except that it doesn't protect the sources of the journalist's sources. Now, if you're an investigator, why would you bother going to get a warrant when you can easily, freely look into the metadata of anybody that you suspect has been talking to the journalists? Has it been used? Hard to tell. But we know the metadata was used before the legislation was introduced to investigate the sources of leaks about the conditions on Manus and Nauru. Now, whatever your opinions are about the rights and wrongs of the actual detention centre, it's hard to justify using metadata to investigate the sources of the conditions on those islands on national security grounds. Politically embarrassing? Perhaps. National security? I don't think so. And of course, most recently we've seen the whole debate around the foreign interference legislation. Now again, I don't want to speak too much about that simply because that is currently being reviewed by the government, but the first drafts suggested that the government was starting with the assumption that if there was any unauthorised communication about a security issue between a Commonwealth civil servant and a journalist, it was by definition treasonous. We need to push back. We need to protect free speech. There's an organisation that speaks about the grey zone. By the grey zone, this organisation means that space that we have in our democracy, a pluralist democracy, which allows us to disagree without breaking down into fights. It allows us to have open debates, conversations, disagreements about the rights and wrongs of a particular policy. It allows us to sit side by side with people who are of different faiths, different ethnicities, without descending into a kind of sectarian or religious or ethnic battle. It's absolutely fundamental to the way our democracy works. Now, what organisation uses the term the grey zone? It's not Amnesty International, it's not some human rights group, it's not a democracy, pro-democracy organisation. It's Islamic State. A few years ago they published an article, a front page article, on the online magazine called The Big, called The Extinction of the Grey Zone. Because Islamic State wants to destroy that area. They recognise that that is antithetical to what they want in society. They want to make it binary, Muslim or nothing, and not just Islamic, but their very narrow slice, their very narrow brand of Islam. And in their argument, guess who they quote in their favour in support of the campaign to eliminate the grey zone? It was George W. Bush. The war on terror, you were either with us or you were with the terrorists. A binary choice, nothing in the middle. So, what all of those statistics show us, what the recent trends show us, is the way that governments have been using national security all over the world, whether authoritarian or supposedly liberal democracies, to chip away at some of the most fundamental elements of our democracy. Now again, I'm going to get very boring by continuing to say this. I recognise the need to protect ourselves in a changing world. But to me it seems absolutely ludicrous to think that in the process of trying to protect our democracy, we're chipping away at one of the most fundamental pillars of that democracy, and that is a free press that holds governments to account. It's not always pretty, it's not always edifying, but it is absolutely fundamental to the way that we work. We can't do without it. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to conclude with a quote from a French philosopher, Albert Camus, who said, that a free press can, of course, be both good and bad, but a press that is not free can never be anything but bad. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Peter. What a terrific speech, and I enjoyed the slides. It wasn't death by PowerPoint. So now we're going to open up for questions. Can I please ask that the questions are one sentence to maximum and that they end with a full stop? We're here tonight to hear from Peter on his views, not on other people's personal views. Thank you. So, could we have the lighting so actually, oh, people are out mics, that's great. So, we take, oh, you're not over this mic then.
Yeah, hi Peter, I'm Rob, and despite my grey hair, I'm actually a student journalist at the University of Notre Dame, so I had a question. Can you envisage any act or any atrocity, say maybe 1,000 times worse than 9/11, that it is worth foregoing a free press for?
Look, an act of atrocity 1,000 times worse. I can't envisage it because I would argue that a free press is so fundamental to the way that we work, the way that we live and function as a society, that the way that democracy works, that if you end up taking that away, we end up with an authoritarian regime, we end up with authoritarianism. Now, I've seen some pretty awful places, I've seen some pretty disastrous, I've lived and worked in places like Somalia, like Afghanistan, like Egypt. And I'm telling you now that there aren't many people who live in those societies who are particularly happy with them. I recognise that we have a security problem. Again, I've said that before and I'll say it so many times again. I do not want anybody to suggest that I am somehow in favour of the terrorists and the extremists. But if you think of the way that democracy works, Democracy 101 has the three fundamental branches of government, the executive, the judiciary and the legislature, and the fourth estate, the media, which is designed to be the public's eyes and ears. Now again, we've seen the way things go if you don't have a free press. And it's never pretty. You suggest, one of the things about your questions implies that there is a trade-off between free press and violence, free press and extremism. And if somehow if we give up that freedom, then we will end up with security. And I don't think that's a reasonable kind of assumption. Because I think that if we look at history, one of the things that history tells us is that one of the most effective bulwarks against extremism is the cold light of day, is the disinfecting effect of sunlight, daylight as the expression goes. That if journalists are free to interrogate extremism of all stripes, then we've got the capacity to knock it down. And look, as an academic, as a newly minted academic, as someone who's still trying to get to grips with this, the world of academia, what I've learned as a part of the scientific method is that you have a thesis, you hold it up to scrutiny, you allow people to knock it down. If it gets knocked down, you know that you've got a bad thesis. The longer it stands up to challenge, the better it is, the better that theory is. And it's the same, I think, with democracy, with a free press. If you've got a policy, an idea, the more it stands up to scrutiny, the more confident you can be that it's the right approach. But equally, the more chances you've got of knocking down bad ideas. And so I would argue that a free press is actually a pretty good way of mitigating against it, that kind of extremism. One more thing I will say about this is there is a reason why I think Australia is one of the most peaceful, stable and prosperous places on the planet. It's because we've got a system that works, and part of the fundamental of that system is a press that's free. Again, I recognise it's not always pretty, it's not always edifying, but it's worked.
G'day, Peter. Brian from Canada. I just like to ask a question about Malcolm Turnbull's recent policy on funding war games, war infrastructure. Like war is a racket. He had a recent visit from Netanyahu. Next thing is becoming part of the war is a racket cabal. What are your feelings on that?
We need to be putting our investment into other areas and not encouraging more conflict with more weapons. I think it's pretty straightforward. Yes?
Peter, my name's Ed Davis and I'm with ABC Friends. Thanks for your great lecture. You've stressed the importance of the free press. To what extent does this intersect with or rely on robust public broadcasting?
I think that's really crucial. Okay, this is going to take a few minutes. One of the problems that we've got, particularly in the digital age, is that the business models for journalism have collapsed. There are a whole bunch of experiments, but we haven't really, I certainly haven't seen any example of a sustainable model that is reproducible. There are a few news organisations that say that they're able to make profits at the moment, but no one that really is able to genuinely produce news and profits at the same time, and certainly not the kinds of profits that would fund the kind of journalism that we really need. And that's not necessarily the kind of journalism that we always would want. It's a little bit like eating greens. We all know that we ought to be eating spinach, but there's a tendency to go for McDonald's. But unless we produce spinach, we're never going to be able to have that. I think that the problem that we have is that we cannot work without, you can't have good journalism without an independent source of funds backing it. Now, one of the things that I really admire about the BBC is the licence fee concept. I don't know how many of you here know what the licence fee works. A few hands going up, the bulk of you probably not. If you have a television in the UK, you have to pay a licence for that television, and that money then goes directly to the BBC. It's ring-fenced from the government. The Treasurer can't get his hands on it. And that's good for a couple of reasons. It's good because the money is tied directly to the way most people used to consume news. I recognise that's not working at the moment. But it's also completely ring-fenced from either government or political or business interests. The BBC knows that it's getting that cash. And as a model, I really like that idea. Because what it means is that the BBC as an organisation, as an institution, is able to produce and invest and produce news for its own sake. Because editorially this stuff makes sense. And even if not everybody watches or consumes that news, that stuff still enters the public debate. It still enters the public discourse. We need those kinds of stories. We need programs. We need to support programs from public funds. As I said, even if not everybody consumes that stuff, because ultimately it feeds into the news. Now, I've done this before. I've asked people to put their hands up who watches Four Corners. I'll do it again, a wage of quite a lot of you. That's good to see. I'd also suggest this isn't necessarily a typical audience. And the reason I say this is I know for a fact that Four Corners gets about, on a good night, about 500,000 viewers, which is a lot, but in a country of Australia's size, it's still a very significant minority. But the news, that the stuff that Four Corners, the investigations that Four Corners produces, like the Dondale investigation, that enters the public discourse, it changes things. We need that. I think we need to have a conversation about how we finance public broadcasting, because with the ABC, with funds coming from the Treasurer's pocket, It's always vulnerable to political winds, and that's a real problem. And that's why I'd like to see a model like the BBC's being introduced. And I think we can, I haven't got very clear ideas. I've got some ideas about how that might happen. I think that you could perhaps impose, take some money back from Google and Facebook and Twitter and give that to public broadcasting in some form, or perhaps have a tax on data, which is tied to the way that we consume news now. A line that's very clear, a data levy perhaps at the bottom of everybody's data plan that says that 1 cent for every gigabyte that you use goes directly to the ABC perhaps. But you can see it's there, the Treasurer can't touch it. It completely bypasses them. But somewhere along the line we need to protect a form of journalism that's publicly funded that is not vulnerable to commercial or political pressure. I think that's absolutely right.
I'm George. I grew up in post-Soviet Eastern Europe. How do you define who a journalist is and who is not, especially regard to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks?
Okay. This is a really difficult question. It's becoming increasingly complicated in a digital world where anybody with access to a computer and an internet connection can publish stuff and call themselves a journalist. I'm going to say something controversial. I've been hounded a lot on Twitter by people who want me to support Julian Assange. And as much as I'd like to, I can't, not as a journalist. Because I don't think that what Julian Assange did was journalism. Julian Assange runs a site called WikiLeaks. Everybody knows about it. WikiLeaks is an open pipeline of information into the public. A lot of it's been very helpful, been very beneficial, but journalism is about mediating the information. It's about interpreting, making sense of the information. What Edward Snowden did was take a trove of information and give it to The Guardian. And The Guardian went through that information and it sifted out a lot of the names, a lot of the things that the information would identify individuals. It made sense of that information. It contextualized it, and that's what good journalism is. It takes reporters who have experience and knowledge, who take that information to experts who have experience and knowledge about that information, and interprets it so we can make sense of it. What Julian Assange did was simply take a whole trove of information and chuck it out into the public sphere. Now I recognise that you can make that kind of libertarian argument that says that we need to have the kind of transparency that Julian Assange is advocating for, but I'm afraid I can't back him as a journalist. I'm not entirely convinced that was the right thing to do. But that still makes it very difficult for us to define who is a journalist when we talk about bloggers. We talk about citizen journalists. One of the big problems when that graph earlier, those two graphs in fact, about journalists who are killed and imprisoned, it's a very difficult thing to define. Those numbers are in fact very, very conservative because they conform to the CPJ's relatively narrow definition of who is a journalist and who is not. One of the guys who I have enormous respect for, a fantastic character called Allah Abdel Fattah, who was imprisoned alongside me in Egypt, who is still there, an extraordinary man, one of the sharpest intellects I've ever come across, someone who I love very dearly, who actually helped me survive prison. I don't call him a journalist, he's a blogger. He's a very important character, very influential in Egypt. Had an awful lot to say about Egyptian democracy, was enormously influential. Does that mean that we should be defending him? Absolutely, as a writer. As someone who is exercising his right of free speech. He's someone that Penn supports. But he falls outside the definition of what I would consider to be a journalist. It's a very, very difficult thing that's becoming even harder.
Two questions. One is that do you care to comment perhaps on how well Australian journalists are coping with this tension about the pursuit of freedom of speech and then balancing it with the responsibilities? Perhaps incidents like the criticism that was levelled against how the ABC handled the documents found in the PMC filing cabinets. And secondly, as someone who's now teaching young journalist students, we've got a generation of young people coming through who have not really grown up in an environment where they are accustomed to trusted sources and then peripheral, that they are used to unmediated sources. How do you, and also the sort of career precariousness of journalism in the new and changing landscape, how do you actually get people to invest the time in learning the craft and learning its norms and conventions when that requires time and perhaps money and a career path that is changing?
Okay. Let me deal with the first question. I think the example that you gave of the filing cabinet the ABC had, the PMC's cabinet, I personally think that the way that the ABC handled it was far too conservative. And that's because I think that the ABC was vulnerable to the kind of political pressure that I was speaking about a moment ago. The ABC has a very proud tradition of standing up to government regardless of who's in power, but I still think that it makes it a little bit gun-shy from time to time, particularly given some of the criticisms that it's been facing over recent years. And so I feel personally that it probably was handling it quite conservatively. The press more broadly has an image problem, and I think there's a massive tension, you alluded to that in the question, between the pressures for clicks to get stuff out there quickly, salaciously, to try and generate views. And I promise it drives the agenda, the journalistic agenda, in ways that you really struggle to comprehend. The most important, there are in every newsroom pretty much in the country, there are daily editorial meetings where editors and journalists sit down and decide what stories to tackle and the way that they tackle it. And in the old days it used to be that it was the editorial value of the story that really mattered. Now the most important person in the room is the online guy who'll tell you which stories have been generating clicks and which are the ones that are going to generate clicks. Every journalist is measured by the amount of attention that their stories get online, by the numbers of clicks and the amount of time that people spend on those stories. And that undercuts the best journalism, because frankly the best journalism is the stuff that the surveys time and again tell us is not popular. It's expensive, investigative journalism, foreign news, deep political news. We can't cover that stuff if you're still in a desperate hunt for clicks, and that goes back to what I was saying earlier about the need to find some form of funds, whether we use those, that's independent of government or business interests, and whether we use those funds to either support the ABC or to underwrite journalism across the country more broadly. I still think we need to do that, because we are losing not just the quality of journalism, but we're losing public trust. And here's something else that's really key, and something I'm very proud of. I'm here today because we have the confidence of the public. I know that the Egyptian authorities were busy trying to find stories that we had produced that were somehow compromised our ethical principles. If they'd published that stuff, they'd exposed that stuff, confidence in us would have crumbled. People would have started to think, if they did that kind of stuff, maybe somewhere along the line they were messing around with the Muslim Brotherhood. Maybe, there's no smoke without fire. The fact that they couldn't meant that the public confidence in us was solid. People knew and understood that we were there on spurious grounds, that there was no basis to the allegations against us. And because we had public trust, the politicians had no choice but to push the Egyptian government for us. I was here because of that enormous wave of public support. I'm here because of it. Now again, I'm not telling this story because I'm feeling particularly smug about my own integrity. I'm just saying this because I understand the value, the importance of maintaining public confidence by always sticking to those values. And I worry that in the current environment we're losing touch with those values in a desperate hunt for clicks. We need public support. We need to make sure as journalists that we build that case to defend the journalism that we're producing. And I'm not sure that we're doing it at the moment. The second question, forgive me, I went on a little bit too long with that. I don't know what the answer is for young journalists. We need it. We need good journalism. We need to hold the bastards to account. And yet it's harder and harder to finance it, to pay for good journalism. The university will probably kill me for saying this, but there's a reason why I'm an academic and not a journalist any longer. Because it's very difficult to support a family as a journalist these days. To have a career that lasts beyond 10, 15 years because it's just not paying. But we also need to inspire people about, and there are plenty of journalists who are inspired. We need to be able to keep them motivated, for them to understand not just the glamour of the job, because believe me, it's not as glamorous as it looks, but to make them understand the principles of it and the fundamental value of it to a functioning democracy. Now, I don't have an easy answer. I wish I did, because I'm asked that question a lot. But by God, we need to keep supporting them.
That concludes the lecture. I would like to say there are a couple of things you could do now. You can join PEN Sydney. You're able to do that from our website. And your support helps us to back events like these and to undertake our advocacy work here and across the Asia Pacific and internationally. You can also donate to PEN. If you don't want to become a member, we will take your money very gladly. Either way. You can take our magazine on the way out. There are copies, and Peter will be signing copies of his book in the foyer afterwards, so please get up there, get in early, there'll be a long queue. I saw it in Brisbane. And I'd like you all to join me in thanking Peter once again.